Bedtime Reading. Gulliver's Travels. Part 1. A Voyage to Lilliput. Chapter 1. A Terrible Storm. My father was not a rich man, but he did have a small piece of land in a town called Nottinghamshire in England. He was lucky to marry a strong woman who gave him 5 healthy sons. Of these 5 sons, I was in the middle. My father wanted me to become a doctor, so he sent me to study in the city of Cambridge. I studied hard and became an excellent student of medicine. However, in my heart, I did not wish to become a doctor, living a boring life in the city. I wanted a life of travel and adventure at sea. Fortunately, after I had been at the university for 3 years, I found a job as a doctor on a small trade ship. For the next 2 years, I worked on this ship and had many exciting journeys before returning to England. When I arrived home, I bought a house and started a private business as a doctor. A half-year later, I married a lovely young woman named Mary Burton. For a while, our life was quiet and simple. We had 2 children and lived in a small but very pleasant house. After 2 years of this life, I began to feel bored and unhappy. I remembered how excited I had been traveling the seas. Often, I would sit in my doctor's office and dream of sailing away to distant lands. Finally, I discussed my dreams with my wife, and she agreed to let me take a job on a ship that traveled between England and some islands in the South Sea. During the next 6 years, I worked on the ship and saw many foreign lands. When I spent time in these lands, I was able to learn the people's languages and customs very easily. On May 4th, 1699, our ship left England for the South Sea. Though we had traveled there many times, this trip was different. Our captain planned to travel a new way that he hoped would be faster and save us many days. However, I did not know it. This trip would change my life. For a while, the weather at sea was calm and warm. However, when we were near the west coast of Australia, our ship ran into the worst storm I had ever seen. The sky grew black, and thunder and lightning were in the clouds. The wind and waves threw the ship back and forth violently. Then a great wave hit us and made a large hole in the side of the ship. I knew if we did not leave the ship immediately, we would all sink into the water. 5 other men and I got onto one of the small boats we were carrying and rowed as hard as we could. We did not know where we were going, but I prayed that somehow we would find land. But the storm continued, and after 2 hours, we were so tired that we could not row the boat any longer. I felt sure we would die. Suddenly, a great wave turned our boat over, and all 6 of us were thrown into the sea. I swam as hard as I could to stay above the water. Soon, I could not see my friends. I suppose that they all must have died that terrible day, but I was so scared that I did not think about them. My arms fought the terrible waves for what seemed like hours. I grew tired, and my head fell under the water many times. I was afraid some awful sea creature would see my weak body in the water and decide to eat me. I was about to let myself sink into the water and die, when suddenly I felt my feet touch the ground. I looked ahead of me through the rain and saw a beach with many trees. Although the tall waves threw me against some sharp rocks many times, I managed to make it onto the beach. I sat down and thanked God for saving my life. But where was I? Chapter 2. The Tiny Men. After a few moments on the beach, I was so tired that I lay down in the sand and fell asleep without even looking at the land around me. The last thing I remember is seeing the sun sink into the water through the clouds, so I knew that it was late evening. When I awoke, it was morning. I stared up at the cool blue sky above me and listened to the birds singing in the trees. After a few moments, I tried to stand up, but I could not move. At first, I thought that yesterday's dangers had made my body too weak and tired to move. Then, suddenly, I heard some very strange noises. As I listened, I heard the sounds of people around me, but I could see no one. So I am not alone here. Thank God, I thought. I tried to turn my head, but I could not move it in any direction. I turned my eyes down to look at my body and saw that I had been tied down to the ground with hundreds of small ropes. This was why I could not move. Who had tied me up, and why? Could the island be filled with savages? I thought to myself. And why did they use such tiny ropes to tie me? Just at that moment, I felt something moving up my leg. It was small and light, and I thought that perhaps it was a mouse or some other small animal. It moved up my body, and I waited in fear, wondering what I would see. I felt the thing touch my chin and looked down to see what sort of animal was crawling on me. I only hoped it wasn't dangerous. I had never been as shocked in my life as I was at that moment. Standing on my chest was a tiny person. He looked just like a normal human being, but he was only as tall as a writing pen. The little man stood on my chest, pulled out a tiny sword, and pointed it at my head. Although he was so small, he did not seem to be afraid of me. As I stared at him in amazement, the little man shouted something in a strange language. "Hekina dagul," he said. I had no idea what this meant, but I guessed that it was not a friendly greeting. I cried out loudly, and the man fell off my chest and ran away quickly. After a few moments, I felt many tiny people on my body and heard many little voices. The little man with the sword came up to my face and said the same strange words I had heard before. "Hekina dagul," he said. The other men repeated these words as well. I did not know what to think about any of this. Was I dreaming? Or perhaps I really had died in the ocean and was now in some strange heaven. I did not know what to do, but I wanted to get free from the ropes. I moved my body back and forth, trying to break the ropes. When I freed my left arm, the little people began to shout loudly. Quickly, I used my arm to pull off the ropes that held my head to the ground. The little men on my body jumped off, and some of them shouted, "Tolgo funak." Soon, hundreds of these little voices, maybe thousands, were shouting these words. A moment later, hundreds of small arrows flew through the air and hit my hands and face. They felt like tiny needles in my skin. I think many of these arrows must have hit my body, but I was wearing thick clothing, so I could not feel them. I shouted in pain and raised my hands to cover my face. Many small men jumped onto my body and began to attack me with their swords. I guessed they were angry that I was trying to escape them, so I decided the best thing to do was to put my hands down and lay quietly. As soon as I became quiet and still, the men stopped attacking me. I decided the best thing to do was to wait until night, when the tiny people would go to sleep. Then I would have an opportunity to escape this place. I knew that once I freed myself, even a huge army of these tiny people could not defeat me. A few minutes later, I heard the little people begin working on something. When I turned my head a little, I saw many of the tiny people building a platform very near to my head. When the platform was finished, 4 men climbed on top of it. Although he was so small, I saw that one of these men wore clothing that was much nicer than the others. Perhaps he is some kind of leader, I thought. The man stepped forward and looked into my eyes. Although I was angry at being tied down, I thought that this was a very brave thing for the man to do, because he was so tiny and I was so large. The little man began a long speech in his strange language. He spoke in a loud voice and waved his arms around, as if what he was saying was very important. While he spoke, all the other little men were quiet. Although I did not understand the language, I thought that the man's words sounded friendly. As I listened to the leader, I began to hear one word again and again. The man would look at me, point to the land around us, and say loudly, "Lilliput! Lilliput!" I decided that the leader meant that this land was called Lilliput. Sailors tell many stories to each other of strange and wild lands, but I had never heard of Lilliput before, or of these tiny people. When the leader finished his speech, I began to speak to him in every language I knew. I hoped that these people could understand at least one of the languages of Europe. I tried speaking to them in French, English, Dutch, Italian, and many more, but no one answered me. I was trying to tell them that I was a friend and that I did not want to fight with them. As I spoke, I tried to look friendly in the hope that they would let me go. Still, they did not understand any of my words. I had not eaten for more than a day, and I suddenly realized how hungry I was. Although I was lying down, I felt so weak that I stopped speaking. I had to find a way to show these people that I needed food. I lifted my arm slowly so that I would not scare anyone, and pointed at my mouth and stomach many times. The leader quickly understood what I wanted and spoke with the other men on the platform. The others ran down to the ground and began to shout orders to some other men. I wondered how these tiny people would feed me. If all their food were as tiny as they were, it would take hundreds of plates of food to feed a body as big as mine. Soon, many ladders were pushed against my body. Little people carrying plates of food climbed up my body and dropped meat, bread, and vegetables into my mouth. For what seemed like hours, I ate the tiny bites of food they gave me. Then, the little people carried many buckets of some liquid towards my mouth. When I tasted the liquid, I discovered that it was a nice red wine. These people are very good hosts, I thought. After about 30 tiny buckets of this wine, I began to feel very sleepy. The leader of the little men came up and spoke to me again, pointing into the distance and saying the word Mildendo. From the way he waved his arms around, I understood that the people wanted to take me somewhere else. It was easy to guess that they wanted to take me to some place called Mildendo, although I had no idea what kind of place it was. I pointed to my ropes and tried to show the man that I would gladly go anywhere with them if they would only untie the ropes. But the leader shook his head and used his arms to show me that I must be carried to Mildendo as a prisoner. I did not understand how these little people could possibly carry someone as large as I was, but I did not want to make the leader angry, so I nodded my head and lay there quietly. The leader smiled at me and began giving orders to his men. I realized that my eyes were getting very heavy, and I was having a hard time staying awake. I had only had a little bit of wine. What was the matter with me? They must have put some sleeping medicine in the wine, I realized. I did not have any time to feel angry, because in a second everything went dark, and I do not remember anything more. Chapter 3. Meeting the King. When I woke up, I felt the ground moving below me. I looked over to my side as far as I could, and saw that I was lying on a long wooden platform that was set on hundreds of small wheels. I heard strange sounds below me, like the feet of many small horses. I was amazed that these little people were able to lift something as large as my body and place it on this platform. Much later, I learned that when the little people had found me sleeping on the beach the day before, the king of Lilliput had ordered his men to build a platform as big as me with wheels for carrying me into their city. The king's scientists had also built hundreds of pulleys to lift me onto it. It took 2,000 of the king's strongest soldiers to lift me up. Once I was on the platform, the men brought their little horses to pull the ropes. There were 2,000 horses in total and 1,000 soldiers who walked on each side of me. As we traveled, I looked around at this strange new land as much as I was able. I could see the tops of trees on both sides of my body. The largest trees were still shorter than I was. It seemed that everything in this land was very small, not just the people. The mountains were just hills to me, and the lakes were small pools. Because of my great weight, the horses moved very slowly. By evening, we had traveled only a short distance. We slept through the night, and the next morning we continued our journey. Finally, in the middle of the day, we arrived in Mildendo, which I saw was a large city. Mildendo was surrounded by a large wall with a gate. As we passed through this gate, I heard the sounds of thousands of little people running around me. Men, women, and children ran up to look at the large object the soldiers had brought back. When they saw that it was a giant man, they shouted in surprise and fear, and talked to one another excitedly in their strange language. Soon, we stopped moving, and I saw a tiny castle before me. It was no more than 3 feet high, but it was as beautiful as any castle I had seen in Europe. On the second floor of the castle, there was a large golden door. This door opened, and a little man wearing beautiful clothes and a golden crown came out. The man raised his hand in the air, and all the people became quiet at once. I guessed that this man must be the king of Lilliput. The king looked down on me with great excitement in his eyes and began to speak. I could not understand his words, but he seemed friendly. I nodded my head and tried to look peaceful, hoping that he would decide to let me go. I had not stood up in 2 days. When the king finished speaking, I felt myself being moved again. Soon I saw that I was being taken to a building that was larger and stronger looking than any other I had seen. Later, I found out that this was a temple. A few years ago, there had been a terrible murder at this temple, so the king and queen decided that the Lilliputians should not use the temple anymore. Some of the people took a large chain and put it around my left ankle. Then they put the other part of the chain around the temple, so that I was chained to the building. After this, some men came up to me and finally cut the ropes that were tied to my body. For the first time since I had arrived in this strange land, I stood up and looked around me. Chapter 4. My first week in Lilliput. The country of Lilliput was very beautiful, and because I was so tall, I could see much of the land. There were green hills covered with tiny farms, and forests with thick, old trees that went all the way down to the beach. There were little roads, with men on little horses running along them. I thought to myself that Lilliput was just as nice as many of the rich countries in Europe. As I was staring out at the beautiful land, the king approached me on his horse. He stopped a little distance away from me, as if he did not trust me yet, and looked up at my great size. He began to speak to me, so I sat down on one knee to hear what he was saying. After a moment, some other men came to stand in front of me. They had some large pieces of paper with many pictures drawn upon them. The king and his men were able to tell me many things about their country using these pictures. First of all, I already knew that the land was called Lilliput, but now I learned that the little people who lived there were called Lilliputians. I learned that the temple behind me was going to be my home. I hope I can fit inside the temple, I thought. The king then explained that the Lilliputians would take care of me. The king's servants would bring me food and drink 3 times a day, as well as other things I might need. I also was told that I would have teachers to help me learn the Lilliputian language. This made me happy, because I wanted to talk with these amazing little people. I felt sure that I could learn the Lilliputians' language easily, since I had studied so many other languages in my travels. When the king finished speaking to me, he turned to leave. Some soldiers stayed behind and gathered around me. At first, I thought these soldiers were protecting the Lilliputians from me. However, I soon learned that the men were really protecting me from the Lilliputians. After a few moments, a group of the little people surrounded me and began to talk angrily. When they thought the soldiers weren't looking, a small group of men grabbed some stones and threw them at me. Although these stones were extremely tiny, I did not like being hit with them. I certainly did not want to be hit in the eyes. When the leader of the soldiers saw what was happening, he and 2 other soldiers came and tied up the men who had thrown the stones. After they had done this, the soldiers dragged them over to me so that I would punish them. The men looked terribly afraid, and I realized that I could punish them by scaring them a little. I made my face look red and angry and grabbed the group of prisoners. I was able to hold all the men in one of my hands. Quickly, I put them into the pockets of my shirt. Then I took one of the men in my hand and held him over my mouth, as if I was going to eat him. All the men screamed, and some of the women in the crowd screamed also. Everyone in the crowd looked frightened. Then I took out a small knife that I had and held it up to the man's neck. Just when it seemed like I was going to kill the man, I used my knife to cut the ropes from his arms and legs. Then I did the same thing with the other men who were still in my shirt pocket and gently put them all down on the ground. I am sure that the Lilliputians were very glad I had not eaten one of their people, and I guessed that no one else would throw any more stones at me. At this time, the king was meeting with the other leaders of the country. They were trying to decide what to do with me. Later, when I knew the Lilliputian language, I learned that many of these men thought I was dangerous and wanted to kill me, but they were afraid that my large, dead body would be difficult to remove and would spread disease in the country. However, the king of Lilliput thought that I was friendly and did not want to hurt me. He did not want to let me go free at that time, but he believed that I could become friends with his people and help his country. On my first night in Mildendo, I crawled into the building on my hands and knees. The building was too small for me to stand up in, but I could sit up and lie down on the hard floor to sleep. It was very uncomfortable in there at first. Over the next week, the king did many kind things for me so that I would be comfortable in Lilliput. First, when he found out that the temple was not very comfortable for me, he sent 600 men to build me a giant bed. The men did this by taking thousands of their tiny mattresses and putting them together to make a large, soft mattress for me to lie on. He also asked all the women in Mildendo to make me some new clothes. This took a long time, because my shirt and pants had to be very large. The king ordered some other men to be my servants and bring me food and wine when I wanted them. However, I was still tied to the temple as a prisoner. During the first week, I made great progress in learning the Lilliputian language. Luckily, it was a very easy language to learn. At the end of the week, the king came to see me. Finally, I was able to say the words I had wanted to say for a week. "Please, great king, let me walk around freely. I won't hurt anyone." The king shook his head and said, "I cannot let you go yet, friend. There are still many people in this land who are afraid of you and your large size. But soon they will learn to trust you, and then we will let you go." I was unhappy with this answer, but I understood how the tiny people must have felt. To them, I was many times larger than the largest mountain in their land. They probably believed that I was extremely dangerous. It was true that I could kill many Lilliputians with an accidental step of my foot. Soon, I learned that the Lilliputians gave me the name Man Mountain because of my great size. The king continued to speak. "There is one thing you can do to earn the people's trust and become a free man sooner," he said. "Yes, I'll do anything," I said excitedly. "It is a law in Lilliput that only soldiers can carry weapons. Many of our people are afraid that you have dangerous weapons in your pockets "If you let us search your clothing and take any weapons you have, the people would feel much safer. Of course, your weapons will be returned to you when you leave our country." I gladly agreed to the king's request. The next day, the king returned with some other men to take my weapons and other things from me. First, I took everything out of my pockets. Then, I lifted each of these men in the air and put them in my pockets, so that they could see that the pockets were empty. When this was done, the men wrote down a list of everything that I had given them. When they had finished, they gave me the list so that I could see that everything was correct. The writing was very strange. It did not go from left to right, like English, or from top to bottom, like Chinese. Instead, it was written in a circle, with the end of the list at the center of the paper. Then the king and his men asked me to show them how to use my objects. I showed them my pocket watch, and they seemed very interested in how it worked. Then I showed them my comb. At first, I think they thought this was some sort of knife with many blades, instead of a tool for making a man's hair look nice. I also showed them my glasses, compass, and telescope. Finally, I showed the men 2 objects that interested them greatly. The first was my sword, which I am sure must have looked like the biggest, longest knife they had ever seen. It was as long as 7 Lilliputian bodies. The next thing I showed them was my gun. The men asked me to show them how the gun worked. I put a bullet in the gun and said, "Get ready, friends. You are about to hear a very loud noise." Then I fired the gun into the air. Everyone shouted with surprise, and many men fell to the ground in shock. The king ran up to me and explained that I could keep all my objects except my sword and pistol. "But we will take very good care of these weapons, Man Mountain," he said. "Now that you have no more weapons, the people of Lilliput will see that you do not want to hurt them. They will begin to trust you now." Chapter 5. I Become Free. During my first few months in the country of Lilliput, I became very friendly with the king and his people. Soon the people began to trust and like me. The mothers of the little children especially liked me, because I was very good at entertaining their sons and daughters. Often, groups of children would come to play with me. They would run up to where I sat and ask to be picked up. I would put groups of them on top of my head and allow them to play on my hair. I also let them dance on my hands and climb all over my enormous body. I believed that becoming friends with the people would help my chances of freedom, so I was careful to make friends with the important people in the Lilliputian government. Often, I would speak with 2 certain men who worked for the king. Their names were Flimnap and Reldresal. Flimnap was the treasurer of the government, and Reldresal was the king's secretary. The king himself also became my good friend. Every few days he would come and visit me, and we would have interesting conversations. One day, the king told me that his people wanted to entertain me outside of my home. First, there was a great feast. The king's servants had prepared many hundreds of dishes for me to try. I ate tiny chickens and roasted meats, and drank many cups of delicious wine. Of course, the feasting took a very long time because I had to eat so much. Then the king told me that his people wanted to show me something special. Some of the Lilliputians practiced a very interesting sport. In this sport, some men would dance and jump on a rope that was tied high in the air between two trees. They had practiced this skill from a very young age, so they didn't fall very often. Later, I learned that this sport was not just a game. It was used to choose important men to work for the king. The king believed that the man who could jump the highest and dance the best would be a good leader, so the king would bring him to live at the palace. Then that man would be given a high position in the government. Also, sometimes the officers who already worked in the government had to play this game to prove that they had not lost their skills. I thought this sport was very dangerous, and it was true that men sometimes fell off the rope and died. Each time I saw the king, I asked him when I would be set free. One day, the king said to me, "Man Mountain, I believe that you are friendly, and I think my people can trust you. All my most important officers trust you, except one of my highest officers. I cannot let you go until all my men agree that it is safe." The king told me that the man who didn't trust me was named Skyresh Bogolem. He was one of the most important officers in the government, so his opinion was very important. I had never met Skyresh, so I did not know why he did not like me. Eventually, the other officers and the king persuaded Skyresh that I should be released. However, Skyresh said that the king should make me agree to a list of conditions first. When the list of conditions was finished, Skyresh came and read the list to me. The people of Mildendo were curious about the list, so they came to listen to Skyresh read the conditions. They wanted to hear what I would say. That day, Skyresh stepped in front of me and read the list in a loud voice. "Our great king of Lilliput has made a decision. If the Man Mountain wants to be released, he must agree to 8 conditions. First, the Man Mountain cannot leave our country without first asking the king. Second, the Man Mountain will not enter our capital city of Mildendo without the king's permission. He must tell us 2 hours before he wants to go to the city, so that the people can hide in their homes. This is because the Man Mountain's movements are very powerful, and we do not want him to hurt anyone. Third, he must walk only on our large roads and not lie down in our fields. Fourth, he must be careful not to step on any of our people, their animals, or their homes. If he wants to pick a Lilliputian up in his hands to talk to him, he must ask that person first. Fifth, he should agree to carry the king's letters to distant lands once every month. Sixth, the Man Mountain should help Lilliput fight against our terrible enemies who live on the island of Blefuscu. He should destroy all our enemies' ships because they are preparing to attack us. Seventh, the Man Mountain should help our men to lift large stones to build buildings and walls in our great city. Eighth, within 2 months from now, the Man Mountain must measure the exact size of Lilliput. To do this, he must count how many of his footsteps it takes to walk around the island. If the Man Mountain promises to follow these conditions, he shall receive his freedom and the great friendship of our people. He will also receive enough food and wine to feed 1,720 of our people every day. I thought about these conditions for a few moments. Some of the conditions were not very respectable. I did not want to help these people fight a war. I knew that Skyresh Bogolam, not the king, had written these conditions. However, I thought it was best to agree to the conditions anyway. When a Lilliputian makes a promise to someone, the custom is to hold his right foot in his left hand and put the middle finger of his right hand on top of his head and say the king's name 3 times. I did this and then bowed to the king to show that I agreed to everything. Then Skyresh Bogolam unlocked my chains. Finally, I was free. Chapter 6. I learn more about Lilliput. Now that I was finally free, I wanted to obey the king's conditions. So I helped the men build more buildings by lifting large stones, and immediately measured the size of Lilliput. A few days after I had been set free, I decided to explore Mildendo. When I walked around, the king sent a guide to answer any questions I might have about Lilliput and its people. The city of Mildendo looked like a beautiful city in some rich part of England or Europe. There were many trees, parks, wide streets, and large houses. The guide told me that Mildendo had over 500,000 people. The thought of so many tiny people living in the world amazed me. Seeing this beautiful, strange new city made me want to spend time with these tiny, wonderful people. I could hardly believe that I was the first man to discover Lilliput, and I wanted to learn more about the people's history and culture. The king's palace was in the center of the city. There was a wall around the palace as high as my waist. The palace itself was 5 feet tall. I asked the king's permission to step over the wall so that I could look more closely at the palace. On the palace, there was a large tower with many windows. My guide told me that the king and his family lived inside the tower. The king hoped that I would look at his rooms, and I was very interested to see them. I walked up to the tower, bent down, and looked through the little windows one by one. Inside, I saw beautiful rooms with old furniture and paintings on the walls. Even though the palace was tiny, it looked just like the homes of the great kings of the world. In one window, I saw the room where the queen of Lilliput lived. She had many children who lived with her. My guide told me that the king and queen were the only parents who raised their own children. All the other children in Lilliput were sent to schools when they were young. They were only allowed to visit their parents twice a year, and each time only for half an hour. This custom seemed strange to me, and I wondered if the children liked leaving home at such a young age. When the queen saw me sitting at the window, she smiled at me and walked over to the window. She opened the window and reached out her tiny arm so that I could kiss her hand. It was a wonderful feeling to be treated so well by this great and beautiful queen. One morning, about a week after this, the king's secretary, Redrisol, came and visited me at my temple house. He asked me if he could speak to me for an hour. Of course, I said. Redrisol had been a good friend to me and had said many nice things about me to the king and his officers. Redrisol told me that at this time, the country of Lilliput was facing many dangers. He explained to me that there were 2 groups in the government. One group was called the Tremeksan. This group followed the old laws of Lilliput and had many violent ideas. The other group was called the Slamakson, and they followed the new laws, which the king had created. The Tramakson wore shoes with high heels, and the Slamakson wore shoes with low heels. Though there were more Tramakson than Slamakson, the Slamakson held all the highest positions in the government. Then Reldresal told me that the anger between these two groups was so great that they would not speak to each other or even eat in the same building. The king is very worried because his oldest son, who will soon become king, wears one shoe with a high heel and one shoe with a low heel. At this time, it seems that the prince cannot decide which group he agrees with, and we are afraid that when he becomes king, he will become a Tramakson. We do not want a king who follows the old violent ways. However, we have another problem that is even more serious. We are at war with the people of the island of Blefuscu. Who are they? Are they as small as you are? I asked. Yes, they are as small as we are, answered Reldresal. Why are you at war with them? Have they done something to hurt your people? I asked. Reldresal then told me a very strange story. You see, Man Mountain, he said, many years ago, when our king's grandfather was the leader, all men in our land broke their eggs on the large end. But one day, when the king's son was opening an egg, he cut one of his fingers. Because of this accident, the old king made a law that all people must break their eggs on the small end. He ordered that all men breaking their eggs on the large end should be killed. I thought the actions of the old king were very strange. Why should people be killed for breaking open eggs the wrong way? However, I said nothing and continued to listen to Reldresal's story. The old king's law angered the people of the island of Blefuscu because they had always opened their eggs at the large end. They disagreed with the Lilliputian king's new law, and they felt that breaking eggs from the small end was a terrible thing to do. So the Blefuscudians started a war with our country. Since this law was made, there have been 6 wars between our two countries. In this time, one of our kings has died, and another has lost his position as leader. Also, many of the Lilliputian people still like to break their eggs at the large end, so they left Lilliput and moved to Blefuscu. In Lilliput, we have already put 11,000 people to death for breaking their eggs at the large end. Many Lilliputians wrote books about which end of the egg was best, and the writers who did not agree with the new law were killed, and their books were burned. Now, the people of Blefuscu have prepared many ships to attack our country. The king hopes that you will help us fight the Blefuscudians and protect our great country from harm, Man Mountain. I thought about the king's request for a while. I believed that the Lilliputians' war with Blefuscu was silly and foolish, but I was new to the country, and I wanted to help these little people who had been so kind to me. Besides, I was not attacking another country. I was only defending Lilliput. Finally, I agreed to help the Lilliputians with their war. Chapter 7. War and Troubles. The island of Blefuscu was only 800 yards north of Lilliput, but I had not yet had a chance to see this country. While preparing for war with the people of Blefuscu, I stayed away from the north side of Lilliput, so that none of the Blefuscudians' ships would see me. The king told me that the Blefuscudians had 50 warships that could hold about 30,000 people. After learning these things about the people of Blefuscu, I made a plan of attack and asked the king's best officers to help me. I had been told that the water was 8 feet in the deepest part and 4 feet in the shallowest part. I gave an order for 50 strong ropes to be made. Then I asked people to put 50 large hooks at the ends of these ropes. On the day of the attack, I was the first to see the Blefuscudians' ships coming to Lilliput. I walked out into the water to meet the ships. I did this easily because the water was not very deep at that point. When the Blefuscudians saw me coming towards them in the water, I am sure they thought I was some kind of horrible sea monster. Many men jumped out of their boats, screaming loudly, and swam towards the beach of Lilliput. I took my ropes and attached one to each warship. The men who had stayed on the ships shot arrows and fired their cannons, but I had worn my thickest clothes so that none of their weapons would hurt me. At this point, I did something that the Lilliputians did not expect. The Lilliputians had expected me to tie the Blefuscudians' ships together and then push them out to sea. Instead, I turned towards Lilliput and began to pull the ships onto their land. This was easy for me to do because the Lilliputians' ropes and hooks were strong. However, when the water became deep, the Lilliputians who were watching me pull the ships could not see me any longer. Many people on the beach said, "Oh no! Man Mountain has drowned! And look! Now our enemy ships are coming to attack us!" I was too busy pulling the ships to tell them that everything was all right. However, in a few moments, the water became less deep, and my head rose out of the water again. When the people saw me pulling the Blefuscudian ships with the ropes, everyone shouted and cheered joyfully. I held up the ropes high in the air and said loudly, "The enemy has been captured! Long live the King of Lilliput!" The King of Lilliput ran forward and said to the people on the beach, "Great Man Mountain, for capturing some of our enemies, the Blefuscudians, I now give you a special name, the name of Nardak. This is the highest honor in our kingdom." I felt very proud and grateful, and everyone cheered. But the king had not yet finished speaking. "Good Man Mountain, now that you have helped my country win our battle with Blefuscu, there are some other things I would like you to do," he said quickly. "You have captured many of the enemy's ships today, but there are still more. I want you to find all the Blefuscudians' ships and bring them to me. This way, the Blefuscudians cannot attack us any more, and I will be able to rule Blefuscu," he cried. "Then we can go to that terrible island and destroy all the people who break their eggs at the large end. I will send one of my best officers to govern Blefuscu. All the Blefuscudians will obey me, and I will be the most powerful king in the world." All the Lilliputians were more excited than ever, and everyone shouted and clapped. However, I did not know what to think. The king's ideas bothered me very much. It did not seem fair to kill or hurt the Blefuscudian people just because they believed differently than the Lilliputian king. I knew I could never kill anyone, and I told the king so. When the king realized that the Man Mountain would not help him rule Blefuscu, he was extremely angry. "You are a traitor, Man Mountain! You are not grateful for everything I have done for you," he shouted. Then he turned and walked away with all his officers around him. I could not believe that the king was so angry with me. Hadn't I helped his people? From that time on, there were certain officers, especially Skyresh Bogolem, who spoke badly about me to the king whenever they could. Because the king was angry with me, he believed everything these people said. I have done so much for Lilliput, yet the king treats me terribly, I thought angrily. However, I did not say anything, because I hoped that soon the king would change his mind. About 3 weeks after I had captured the ships, some officers from Blefuscu came to Lilliput to see the king. The Blefuscudians wanted peace with Lilliput because they knew that the Lilliputian king was much stronger than they were. I am sure that greedy king was very happy about that. Although the king was angry with me, I was still allowed to come to the castle and talk to people. The Blefuscudian officers saw me and were very interested in speaking to me. I was very friendly to them. They asked me to show them how strong I was, so I gave them some examples. I think that the Lilliputians, who were still friendly to me, must have told the Blefuscudian officers that I was on their side, because one of the Blefuscudian officers said to me, "Good Man Mountain, we would like to invite you to visit our country as our friend. The Blefuscudian king would like to meet you." "I would love to visit your country, friends," I said. "I have heard that your king is very famous, and his country is beautiful." So we agreed that I would come to Blefuscu as soon as I could. Chapter 8. The Fire. A few days after the meeting between the Lilliputians and the Blefuscudians, I went to ask the king's permission to visit Blefuscu. Of course, the king was still angry with me, so he would hardly look at or speak to me. He said in a cold voice, "You may go," and walked out of the room. Later, I found out that Skyresh Bogolem had told the king that I was saying bad things about Lilliput to the Blefuscudian officers. This was a lie, of course. One night, before I visited Blefuscu, a strange and terrible thing happened. One of the queen's maids fell asleep without blowing out her candle. The part of the palace where the queen and her children lived caught fire. Some people ran to get me at my temple house, where I was sleeping peacefully after a big dinner and much wine. "Hurry, Man Mountain! You must help us! Come to the castle quickly!" they cried. As I hurried to the palace, I could hear shouts of "Fire!" in the Lilliputian language. The Lilliputians were trying to put out the fire by throwing tiny buckets of water onto the palace. However, the fire was too big, and there was not enough water to put the fire out. I could see that the fire was spreading very quickly, and I knew that the queen and her children would die if I did not think of something. Suddenly, I had an idea. The night before this, I had drunk many bottles of a delicious red wine made in Lilliput. The wine was still inside my body, and I had to go to the bathroom very badly. Quickly, I began to urinate on the fire, and in a few moments the fire was destroyed. I had saved the queen and her children's lives in a very strange way. I was afraid that the king of Lilliput would be even angrier with me than before, because urinating near the king's palace is a terrible crime in Lilliput. However, the king decided to forgive me for what I had done, because I had saved his queen's life. But my actions made me many enemies anyway. The queen was so angry and horrified when she found out what I had done that she decided never to live in that part of the palace again. Now, she was my bitter enemy, and she told all her friends that she would have her revenge on me. Chapter 9. Accused. The queen had many friends in important positions. She was able to convince these friends to speak badly about me to the king. The king was already angry with me because I had refused to help him control the Blefuscudian people. For many weeks, I was not asked to attend the king's meetings, and I began to be afraid that the king and my enemies might be planning to hurt me. Luckily for me, I still had one friend in the palace. Reldrizal was my loyal friend, and he felt that I had done great things for Lilliput and its people. He wanted to protect me from anything that Skyresh-Bogolim or my other enemies might do. One night, Reldrizal came to see me in secret. "Man Mountain, you must listen to me carefully," he said. "In the past few weeks, the king has had secret meetings with his officers about what should be done with you. Finally, 2 days ago, the king decided to accuse you of treason." "How can this be? I haven't done anything wrong," I cried. "Many of your enemies have found reasons to be angry with you. The king is angry because he wants to control Blefuscu, and you would not help him by capturing all their ships. Skyresh-Bogolim is terribly jealous of you because he worked his whole life to capture the Blefuscudians' ships for the king, but he always failed. Then you came and did it in 1 day. Finally, Flimnap, who controls Lilliput's money, feels that it is too expensive to keep feeding you." I wanted to defend myself. "Reldrizal, as long as I have been on Lilliput, I have only done what the king ordered me to do. I know I did not help the king capture Blefuscu, but that is because I think that it would be wrong for me to kill people. It seems to me that the king liked me as long as I did what he wanted. But when I did not agree with him, he decided I was a traitor and believed all the lies my enemies told him. I know that my food and drink are expensive, but it was the king who decided to imprison me here in the first place. So Flimnap, the treasurer, should be angry with him. Now, please tell me clearly, what sort of crimes am I accused of?" "Man Mountain, you do not have to defend yourself to me. I agree that you have done nothing wrong," Reldrizal said calmly. "Now, I have a list of the accusations here. I will read them to you," said Reldrizal. Then he began to read. Accusation 1. The law of Lilliput is that no one may urinate near the palace, and those that do will be guilty of treason. The Man Mountain urinated on the palace on purpose, even though he knew this was wrong. Accusation 2. After capturing many of the Blefuscudian ships, the Man Mountain would not follow the orders of the great and wonderful king of Lilliput. He did not capture the rest of the ships. He did not kill the armies of Blefuscu, and he did not go and kill the people who break their eggs on the large end, as the king wanted. Accusation 3. The Man Mountain treated the officers of Blefuscu very kindly, even though the people of Blefuscu were our enemies at that time. If the Man Mountain is truly loyal to Lilliput, he would not treat Blefuscudians with kindness, as they are terrible people who break their eggs on the big end. Accusation 4. The Man Mountain plans to visit Blefuscu and has not received a written letter of permission from our king. No true and loyal friend of our king would do any of these terrible things that the Man Mountain has done. I was angrier than ever now. "These accusations are ridiculous," I said. "First of all, the king decided to forgive me when I urinated on the palace. I saved his queen's life when I did that. Why is he changing his mind now? Don't you understand, Man Mountain? The king and your enemies want you to be guilty, so they have to invent things," said Redrizal. The king's accusations were very unfair and also silly. I knew that Redrizal agreed with me, but it seemed that there was no way we could change the king's mind. "So what will the king do with me? What is the punishment for these crimes?" I asked. Redrizal looked very serious. "Man Mountain, the usual punishment for these crimes is death," he said. I thought about this for a moment. "And how does the king plan to kill me?" I asked. "Luckily, the king does not want to kill you. He is still angry with you, but he knows that you have also helped our country. However, Skyresh Bogolem wants you to die. He suggested that your house be set on fire with you inside it. 20,000 soldiers should wait outside with poisoned arrows to shoot in case you try to escape the house," said Redrizal. "However, the king did not agree with this plan." "Well, it's good that the king doesn't want to kill me, at least. I knew he would remember my good service to him someday," I said. Redrizal sighed. "I'm afraid that is not true, my friend," he said. "Instead of killing you, the king suggests that your eyes should be poked out as a punishment. Then he can still put your strong body to work." "Poke my eyes out?" I shouted, shocked and angry. "How could anyone be so cruel?" "Yes, it is a cruel idea. But Flimnap did not think this was a good idea. He said if your eyes were poked out, the people would still have to feed you every day. If you were working hard for the country, you might eat even more, and Flimnap doesn't want to spend the money to feed you," Redrizal explained. "So what did the king finally decide?" I asked. "The king has finally decided that first your eyes will be poked out. Then your food will be reduced every day until you are too weak to fight back. Then you will be poisoned. Once you die, he plans to have 10,000 men cut up your body and throw all the pieces into the sea. However, they will leave your bones on the land so that all the people of Lilliput will know the power of our great king." "When do they plan to do all of these things to me? Will I have a trial?" I asked. "Yes," said Redrizal. "Your trial is in 3 days, but since the king is also going to be the judge, you will certainly be found guilty." I thought about everything I had heard, then thanked Redrizal and told him to go back to the palace. There was no way I would let the selfish king and his friends hurt me. "I've got to leave Lilliput at once," I said quietly to myself. Chapter 10. Escape to Blefuscu. I decided that the safest place for me to go would be Blefuscu. Now that the king wanted to punish me, I knew that he would not let me go anywhere. Because of this, I wrote him a letter telling him I was going to visit Blefuscu and did not wait for his response. Blefuscu was not far away from Lilliput, and it only took me half an hour to swim there. When I arrived in Blefuscu, I was instantly seen by many little people. The people had heard about my friendly feelings toward them, so they gladly welcomed me to their country. The first thing I did when I got to Blefuscu was go and speak to the Blefuscudian king. When I arrived at the palace, the king, queen, and their children were waiting for me and smiling happily. "Welcome to our country, Man Mountain," said the king of Blefuscu. "We cannot thank you enough for helping us keep our freedom." That evening, there was a great feast in my honor. There were many bottles of red wine and many delicious dishes. Of course, I had to eat hundreds of plates of food before I was no longer hungry. The Blefuscudian king told me that I could stay on Blefuscu for as long as I wanted, which made me very happy. I decided not to mention my troubles with the Lilliputian people. For the next 3 days, I explored the country. On the afternoon of the third day, I found a nice spot on the beach to sit down. For the first time in a while, I began to think about my home and family. Suddenly, I saw a large object floating in the ocean. Quickly, I walked up the closest mountain, which was like a small hill to me, and climbed up to the top to see what the object was. I was surprised and excited to see that it was a small, empty boat. I quickly ran back to see the king of Blefuscu. I told him about the boat I had seen. "Great king, I have been happy seeing your country. However, today I have begun to think about returning home. I have lived in the lands of little people for almost a year. I am afraid that my wife and children think that I am dead. I have seen a small boat in the ocean, and I need your help to bring it to land." The king agreed to do anything he could and ordered his army to help me get the boat. This army of men quickly prepared 20 of their largest ships, with a few thousand sailors on them, to sail out to the small boat. Meanwhile, I swam out to the boat with some strong ropes and tied them to the Blefuscudian ships. Together, the army of men in their ships and I pulled the boat onto the beach. When we had returned to the beach, I examined the boat. I was very happy to find that it was in good condition. For the next 2 weeks, I built a sail and 2 strong oars for the boat. When my boat was ready, I went to the king of Blefuscu to ask for one last favor. "Dear king," I said, "I do not know how far I am from my home, but I know that I am many weeks away. If I am going to return home safely, I will need a large amount of food and water. Can you give me these supplies?" "Certainly, good Man Mountain," said the king. "However, I am sad to see you go. I had hoped you would stay here in Blefuscu and help me make my country stronger." I understood how the king felt. However, I remembered my bad experiences with the people of Lilliput and their king. I did not want to become involved in the problems of another country. "I am sorry, good king," I said, "but I feel that I must leave and return to my own people." Luckily, the king understood. He gave orders for his people to prepare the supplies of food and water for my journey. While everything was being prepared, I sat down to talk with the king. "Great king," I said, "I am afraid there is something I have not told you. It is about my relationship with the Lilliputian king. Before I left to visit your country, the king accused me of treason. He and his officers were planning to make me a slave and then kill me, so I had to escape." The king of Blefuscu laughed. "Good Man Mountain, I already know what happened to you in Lilliput. The king of the Lilliputians wrote me a letter explaining what you have done. He told me that if I allowed you to stay in Blefuscu, then our 2 countries would be at war once again." "Oh no! Then I must stay and help your people, king," I interrupted. "No, Man Mountain, do not worry. I wrote the Lilliputian king a letter, saying that it was impossible for my people to capture you. After all, you are as big and strong as a mountain. The Lilliputian king knows this. I also said that you were leaving this part of the world, and we would never see you again. I do not think you will have any more trouble, but you can never return here again." When we had finished speaking, it was late at night, so I went to sleep. Early the next morning, it was time to go. Hundreds of Blefuscudians carried food and water to my boat. The king also gave me a special present of 10 tiny cows and 10 tiny bulls. They were only a few inches high. I was excited for the opportunity to show my people these amazing little creatures. When they saw the animals, my family and friends would know that my strange stories were true. The king also gave me a bag of gold coins from Blefuscu and a painting of him and the queen. I put all these things onto my boat and began to sail. Thank you, kind people of Blefuscu. I will never forget you. I hope your country grows large and strong, I cried as I began to sail away. I sailed for a few days before I saw a large ship in the distance. I cried out for joy because the ship had a British flag. Finally, I could travel home. Quickly, I began to sail towards the ship. When I reached the ship, I asked the sailors where they were going. "To England," they cried. "Please take me with you," I said. "I have many amazing stories to tell the captain. He will learn about parts of the world that no human has ever seen before." The sailors were interested in my comments, and so they allowed me to come on board with my belongings. At first, when I told the captain and his men my story, no one believed me. I was not surprised. But when I showed them my tiny cows and bulls and the picture of the king and queen of Blefuscu, they were amazed. 2 weeks later, I was finally home in the city of Nottinghamshire. I thanked the captain and his men and gave him 2 cows and 2 bulls as thanks. Then I hurried to my house. My wife and children were happy to see me after so long, of course. My family had a very good time listening to my stories of my adventures in Lilliput and Blefuscu. My children loved the little cows and bulls and spent many happy hours playing with them. After a few weeks, I decided to sell the little animals to a rich man who collected strange objects from around the world. The man gave me so much money for the little animals that I was able to buy a new house for my family. For the next few years, we lived comfortably and happily together. Part 2. A Voyage to Brobdingnag. Chapter 1. Left Behind. Although my life with my family was calm and peaceful, after a few years, I began to miss my life of excitement and adventure on the ocean. With my wife's permission, I accepted a job on a ship that was going around Africa on June 20th, 1702. For the next year, I made a lot of money trading jewels and silk between India and England. This was interesting work because I was able to see many strange and beautiful cities by the sea. Then, in the middle part of 1703, I was sailing around South Africa when our ship sailed into another terrible storm. For 2 weeks, our ship was blown east by the strong winds. In all this time, we did not see any land or find any water shallow enough to drop our anchor and stop our movement. 15 days later, the wind finally stopped. We were nearly out of food and fresh water. The captain, no longer knowing where we were, decided to sail north in search of land. After 3 days, We saw an island in the distance and sailed towards it as fast as we could. The island was surrounded by large, sharp rocks, and there was no safe place to land. The captain decided to drop anchor and send 10 of us off in a smaller boat to explore the island and search for fresh water. When we were on the beach, we separated from each other and searched in different directions. After a few hours of walking alone, I still hadn't found any food or fresh water. I decided to return to the boat, where I was sure the men were waiting for me. I don't know what we're gonna do. We only have enough food and water for a few more days, I thought. However, when I returned to the beach, I had a horrible surprise. The other men had gotten into the boat and were rowing as fast as they could back to our ship. "Wait! Stop!" I shouted. "What are you doing? You can't leave me here!" Suddenly, I felt the ground below me begin to shake. Before I had time to think, I saw an enormous giant come running out of the forest, yelling loudly. Now I knew why the men had left so quickly. As I watched, the giant ran into the water after my friends. I saw that he was trying to get to their boat, and I didn't want to think about what would happen if he captured them. Fortunately, my friends had begun their escape just in time. They reached the ship and climbed aboard it quickly. The water was too deep for the giant to reach them. The giant returned to the beach, talking angrily to himself. He looked around as if he was searching for more of these tiny people. I had to escape. I ran as quickly and quietly as I could towards a large hill behind me. I climbed up the hill so that I could see the land around me. When I reached the top of the hill, I saw that the island was covered with farms. At first, I thought that the island had many thick forests, but as I looked closer, I realized that what I saw were not trees, but giant corn plants. They were at least 80 feet tall. Many giant people were working on these farms. Amazed, I watched them collect giant carrots, potatoes, and other vegetables into boxes the size of buildings. Although the hill I stood on seemed large to me, I realized that it was no more than a small rock to these people. What kind of country is this? I thought, feeling very afraid. Suddenly, I realized that one of the giants was walking in my direction. I was too afraid to wait and see what would happen. Quickly, I turned and ran towards a field of corn, which seemed like a good place to hide. I reached the corn plants and sat on the ground, trying not to breathe too loudly. Unfortunately, the giant decided to begin harvesting the corn plants. As he cut the corn, the giant vegetables fell all around me. I felt sure that I would be killed by one of them. What's going to happen when the giant sees me? What if he's angry? What if he tries to eat me? I thought. I could only sit quietly in the giant cornfield, hoping that the giant would not notice me. The giant's enormous feet came closer and closer to me. Each of his feet was as large as my house. I saw that if I did not move quickly, the giant's feet would crush me like a fly. However, the corn plants were much too tall for me to climb over. As the giant raised his feet over my head, I had no choice but to yell out to him. Quickly, I screamed as loud as I could, "Stop! Stop! There's someone down here in the cornfield!" Chapter 2. Inside the giant's house. It seemed that the giant heard my cries, because he stopped moving. Then he sat down on his knees and looked into the cornfield carefully, trying to discover what had made the sounds. When his large eyes saw me, he reached down and picked me up in his enormous hand. The experience was incredibly frightening. I felt like a tiny mouse in the giant's strong hand. Now I know how the people of Lilliput felt when they first saw me, I thought. The giant raised me to his eyes and studied me closely. I was afraid the giant would throw me down on the ground and step on me, or even worse, eat me. "Please, sir, don't hurt me," I cried. I took off my hat in greeting. "I am a sailor who is lost, and I do not mean you or your people any harm." The giant looked at me with great interest, and his huge mouth opened in a smile. His fingers were as large as trees, and they were hurting my body. I pointed at his fingers and made a painful face to show him that he was hurting me. He seemed to understand, because his fingers opened and I was able to stand on the palm of his hand. I looked over the side of his hand and immediately wished I hadn't. The distance to the ground was more than 50 feet. If I fell, I would certainly die. I still did not know if the giant was friendly, but his smile made me think that he wouldn't hurt me. I wanted to please him, so I took out a bag of gold and held it up to him. He took the bag in his enormous fingers and looked inside. He did not seem to know what it was, because he immediately gave the bag back to me. Just then, the giant turned his head and yelled something in a strange language. His voice was so loud it sounded like thunder. I felt the earth shake, and suddenly 3 more giants came running out to the cornfield to see what was happening. The giant held me gently in his hand, while the others stared at me and asked the giant many questions. Many times, the giants would reach out and touch me, pulling my clothes and hair. It seemed as if they were trying to discover what sort of animal I was. I took off my coat and hat and handed it to the giants to show them that I was not an animal. The farmer giant picked up my tiny coat in his fingers and held it close to his eyes. Then he handed it back to me. He seemed to understand that I was not an animal, but only an extremely small man. I tried to speak to the giants in every language I knew. I even tried speaking Lilliputian, but no one understood me. Still, the farmer seemed very pleased. Before I knew what was happening, the giant put me in his pocket and told his friends goodbye. Then he began to run towards a house in the distance. To me, the farmer giant's house was bigger than the biggest castle in Europe. When we reached the farmer's house, a giant woman and 2 smaller giants came running out. I guessed that the woman was the farmer's wife, and the other 2, who looked younger, were his children. The farmer said something to his family in an excited voice, took me out of his pocket, and slowly put me down on their kitchen table. Everyone cried out in amazement to see me, a tiny little man, sitting there on the table. On this table was a huge plate of meat and vegetables. On my left side was a loaf of bread as large as one of my ships. I certainly won't have to eat much of this food to fill my stomach, I thought. As I watched, the farmer's wife took out an enormous fork and knife and cut some little pieces of meat for me to eat. I was extremely hungry, because I had not eaten much for several days. It was lucky for me that I still had my knife with me, because even these small pieces of meat were too big for me to put in my mouth. Using my knife, I cut little bites of the meat and began eating hungrily. A few minutes after this, the door to the house opened, and an old woman holding a baby came inside. I guessed that the old woman was the children's grandmother, and the baby was the farmer's youngest child. It was interesting to see an enormous baby. It looked just like my children when they were small, but this baby was about 15 feet tall. The family sat down at the table to eat their dinner with me. They were very interested to watch me try to eat the meat and vegetables. When I had finished my eating, I walked over to the farmer's wife and bowed low, saying, "Thank you for the wonderful meal, madam." The giants seemed to think this was very funny and laughed loudly. The farmer pointed at me and then touched the table in front of him, as if he was telling me that I should come over. As I walked towards him, I examined the enormous fruits and vegetables all around me. When the farmer's baby saw me, he reached out to grab me. I was sure the baby thought that I was a small toy, or perhaps something sweet to eat. However, the child could not reach me and began to cry loudly. The baby's screams made my head ache. Seeing that the baby was upset, the old woman gently picked me up and put me in her grandchild's hands. Instantly, the baby put me in his mouth and began to suck on my head. This was a horrifying experience. I was sure that the child would swallow me any minute, and I would have to spend the rest of my life in a giant baby's stomach. I began to throw my arms and legs around, trying to make the baby open his mouth. This was successful because the baby immediately spit me out. I flew across the room, and luckily for me, the farmer's wife caught me in her hands. All the giants were laughing, but of course I didn't think that this was so funny. After dinner, I began to feel extremely sleepy. The farmer's wife noticed me closing my eyes and placed me on a pillow that was 20 feet long. Then she covered me with her handkerchief, which was as big as the sail on my ship. This was a very warm and comfortable place to spend the night. 2 hours later, I awoke to hear some strange noises. I stood up quickly, and when I saw what was in front of me, almost died from fright. 2 enormous rats with yellow teeth and red eyes were staring at me. They were 2 times as large as I. I knew they were going to eat me if I didn't do something quickly. One of the rats moved forward to attack me, and I took out my sword. When the rat tried to bite me, I moved quickly to the left and stabbed it in the stomach. The rat's blood poured out onto the pillow and covered my body. It fell down dead, and the other rat ran away. I felt very brave for defeating such a terrifying animal. Why don't they have a giant house cat, I thought. I was so tired that I lay down and fell back asleep immediately. A few hours later, I woke up to a loud scream. The farmer's wife was standing over me looking frightened. I realized that I was still covered with the rat's blood, so the farmer's wife must have thought I was dead. Quickly, I jumped up and pointed to the dead rat. When the farmer's wife saw that I was all right, she immediately picked me up and took me to their kitchen. I saw that she wanted to give me a bath. She filled a cup with warm water and pushed me toward it. Then she took off my clothes and gave me a bath. I was very embarrassed about being naked in front of a lady, but that rat's blood was really terrible. After my bath, the farmer's wife gave me a clean pillow and handkerchief, and I lay down to go to sleep again. I felt that this island of giants was even stranger than Lilliput and Blefuscu. I wondered if I would ever see my home in England again. Chapter 3. I begin to work. For the first few weeks in the farmer's house, life was difficult. Everything around me was so big, and I was unable to do anything for myself. The giants had to help me with simple things, like eating food and moving around the enormous house. Luckily, the farmer's daughter, who was a 9-year-old girl named Glumdalclitch, was a kind and sweet young girl. She and I became very good friends, and Glumdalclitch was always happy to help me. Glumdalclitch's mother had taught her many useful skills, so she was able to make me new clothes. Glumdalclitch had a house for her dolls and toys that was the perfect size for me to live in. In this dollhouse, I was able to sleep and live comfortably. She called me Grildrig, which in the giant's language means the tiny man. In the next few weeks, Glumdalclitch became my teacher. She taught me much of the giant's language. I learned that this land was called Brobdingnag. I felt that the farmer and his family were very kind to me, and I was thankful for all their help and protection in this land of giants. Although I was small, I tried to help the family in any way I could. If the farmer asked me to do something, I was always happy to do it. One day, some other giants came to visit the family. The farmer asked me to entertain his guests by showing them my skill with a sword. I was happy to do this, because I knew that the other giants would be interested to see a tiny man. I put on a show for the farmer's guests and even was able to speak to them a little in their language. The other giants were very pleased with me. After I had entertained the guests, one of the giants told the farmer that the people of Brobdingnag would pay lots of money to see me and watch me perform. The farmer thought that this was a wonderful idea. The next day was the day that all the giants went to the market to buy and sell fruits and vegetables. The farmer decided to take me to the market so that I could entertain people while they bought things. He woke me up early that morning, and I saw that he had prepared a small box for me to sit in. He had cut small holes in the top of the box so that I could breathe. I did not like the idea of sitting in a small, dark box, but I wanted to be polite to the farmer. Glumdalclitch was worried that the giants in town might be too rough with me and hurt me in some way. She cried as her father closed the box with me inside it. She told her father that she was coming with us, whether he liked it or not. The farmer agreed, and all three of us got on his horse and rode into town. The giant horse's quick movements made me feel as though I was on a ship in a terrible storm. I began to feel very sick in the small box. Luckily, Glumdalclitch asked her father to stop every few minutes so I could rest a little. When we arrived at the market, the farmer asked some boys to tell everyone that he had found a tiny man and that the man would perform for everyone at the town's inn. Once we were in the inn, the farmer let me out of my box. I stood on a large table with Glumdalclitch sitting next to me. She explained to me what the farmer wanted me to do. She told me that I should first greet each visitor in their language and then drink a toast to their health from a tiny glass. Next, I should show everyone my skills with a sword. The farmer sold tickets to this performance at the door of the inn. Because the room was small, he would only allow about 30 people to see me at one time. After my first performance, the news of a tiny man in Brobdingnag spread quickly through the town. Everyone was excited and was willing to stand in long lines just to be able to look at me. The farmer made me do 12 performances that day. He did not allow me any rest or time to eat. After 8 hours of this work, I was extremely tired and hungry. The farmer's actions made me angry. I was not an animal or a toy, and I wanted to be treated with respect. The farmer made so much money that day that he decided to bring me to the inn the next day as well. Also, many people had heard of my performance and went to the farmer's house wanting to see me. When the farmer realized that he could make money just sitting in his house, he made me perform for people every day. For the next 2 months, I did 10 performances every day and was tired and hungry much of the time. All my good feelings for the farmer disappeared, but I did not know what else to do. I certainly could not escape, because I could not feed or care for myself alone. Luckily, Glumdalclitch was still my good friend. She cared for me every evening after I was finished working. Her friendship helped me to tolerate all the long, boring performances. One day, the farmer decided that he would become even richer if he took me to perform in the capital city of Brobdingnag. This city, called Lilliput, was hundreds of miles away. During our journey, the farmer wanted to stop at many towns and villages so that I could perform for the local people. Glumdalclitch prepared a new box for me to travel in. This box was like a little house, filled with a small bed and some other furniture. On October 12th, we began our journey to Lilliput. Each day, we would stop in 1 or 2 towns, and I would perform many times for the townspeople. After 2 weeks, we finally arrived in Lilliput. The farmer rented a room in the largest inn in the city and decided to use this inn for my performances each day. Like before, I performed 10 times a day. The city people were richer than the townspeople, and they paid a lot more money to see me. Of course, this made the greedy farmer extremely happy. I began to think that I would become seriously ill, or even die from hunger and tiredness, because I was given only a little time each day to eat and sleep. When the farmer saw that I had become thin and weak, he began to worry that I would soon die. Still, he would not let me rest. The richer he became, the crueler and greedier he became. He wanted to make the most money he could from my performances before I died. I did not know when my work would finally end, and I was afraid that I would not live much longer. Chapter 4. I Move to the Palace. Just when I felt that I could not live another week, a letter arrived for the farmer. It was from one of the queen's men, and it ordered the farmer to take me to the palace to visit the queen, who was curious about me. The farmer was very excited that the queen was interested in me, and so Glumdalclitch, the farmer, and I left immediately for the palace. When we arrived at the palace, a servant took us to the queen's rooms immediately. The farmer bowed to the queen and put my box down on her table. "Good queen," the farmer said, "you are about to see the most amazing of animals, a tiny man." I came out of my box and bowed to the queen. "Great queen, may I have the honor of kissing your beautiful foot?" The queen smiled at me.
"My dear little friend, I am afraid this is not possible,"
she said.
"However, you may kiss my hand."
She put her hand down on the table, and I kissed it. The queen did not want me to perform, which made me very happy. Instead, she wanted to hear about my travels around the world and about my people. When I told her about the Lilliputians, she was very interested.
"Why, I thought you were small, but to my people, these Lilliputian people would be no bigger than one of our ants."
After an hour, the queen asked me a surprising question.
Little man, would you like to live here at the palace?
She asked.
I think the great men and women of our country would be very interested in your stories as well. I would make sure that you are as comfortable and happy as possible.
I bowed to the Queen and said, "Dear Queen, thank you for your kind offer. However, I belong to this farmer. If I were free to decide, I would happily come and live here." I truly wanted to live with the Queen, because I knew that the Queen would not make me work all day, as the farmer was doing.
Good farmer, would you sell me this little man?
Asked the Queen. The farmer believed I would soon die from hunger, and he didn't care what happened to me as long as he made more money. Because of this, he was quite happy to sell me to the Queen. "Great Queen, nothing would make me happier," he said. "However, this is a very valuable little man, and I cannot sell him for less than 1,000 gold pieces." The Queen was very rich, of course. She had the money brought to the farmer immediately. When the farmer had been paid, I bowed to the Queen again and said, "Dear Queen, I must ask you something before I begin my life at your palace. Glumdalclitch, this farmer's daughter, has been my friend and cared for me kindly ever since I came to Brobdingnag. May she stay with me and continue to care for me?" The Queen smiled at Glumdalclitch, who bowed.
Certainly, little man,
she said. Glumdalclitch was very happy, since she did not like living in her little town. Her father knew that having a daughter work for the Queen would give him much advantage, so he quickly gave permission for Glumdalclitch to live with me. I was so happy to see the greedy farmer leave that when he walked out the door, I only gave him a small bow. The Queen, who was a very smart lady, watched me and then asked,
"Good sir, why are you not more polite to your old master? He seems like a good man."
"Oh, good Queen, you do not understand. My life here has been terrible for many months now. I have been treated like a servant or an animal." I then told the Queen about the farmer's cruel treatment. She was surprised and angry to hear my story. However, now that you have saved me, dear Queen, I am sure that I will become strong and healthy again.
Certainly you will, my good man. Do not worry. You will always be happy and well cared for at my palace,
the Queen said. The Queen wanted to take me to meet her husband, the King. When the King saw me, he thought I was some kind of mechanical toy. "My Queen, you have been tricked. That farmer has sold you a children's toy. I'll have him arrested at once." I jumped up and said quickly, "No, good King, I am not a toy, but a real man from the country of England. I am very happy to be at your palace, because your beautiful Queen has saved my life." The King was surprised at my words and went to look at me more closely. "What kind of country is this England? Are all the people there as small as you?" I told the King many stories about England and its history, and he was very entertained. "My Queen, you have made the right decision. What a wonderful man you are! You shall receive only the best attention and service." The King ordered that Glumdalclitch should stay with me all the time. He even asked that Glumdalclitch receive a servant of her own as well. He then ordered his best builders to make me a comfortable home to live in. It had to be small and light enough for the Queen to carry around with her. I could hardly believe how quickly my luck had changed. Finally, I was being treated like a human being. A week later, my home was finished. It had a soft bed, a table and chairs, and many beautiful pictures on the walls. It was nicer than my home in England. All my furniture was attached to the ground so that nothing would be damaged when the Queen picked up my house. Each night, I would eat with the King and Queen and tell them about the European countries, people, customs, and history. Although the King enjoyed talking to me, he felt that I did not know the language of Brobdingnag well enough. He ordered his best scholars to teach me how to speak like a king. I was happier than I had been in many months. I was living in a beautiful palace with a king and queen who treated me well and had my good friend Glumdalglitch to spend time with. I spent my days visiting ladies and gentlemen, and my nights eating and drinking delicious food and wine. What a life! Chapter 5. A Talk with the King. My next months in Brobdingnag were very easy. I was able to learn the language quickly, and I began to read the books in the king's library. Reading these books was good exercise for me, because in order to read the giant books, I had to walk from one side of the book to the other and use my whole body to turn the pages. While reading the king's books, I learned much about Brobdingnag and its culture. The people of this country were very interested in science and art. Many of their authors had written books on these subjects. When I was tired of reading books, I would visit with the king or the queen. Each Wednesday night, the king and I would speak together, telling stories about our different cultures. Truly, these evenings were some of my happiest times in the palace. The king's favorite thing to talk about was farming. The giants of Brobdingnag were mostly farmers, and the king was famous for growing carrots and corn, which were many times bigger and more delicious than everyone else's. During one of our conversations, I wanted to impress the king with my knowledge of science. I told him that I could teach him how to make gunpowder. Although their science was very developed, the people of Brobdingnag had no guns or cannons. Great King, with this wonderful thing called gunpowder, you can build cannons and shoot guns that will destroy your enemies' cities in a matter of hours. With gunpowder, you will quickly become a very powerful king, and none of your enemies will be able to defeat you in battle. England is very powerful, and I believe it is all because we have gunpowder. The king looked at me as though he did not understand. Gunpowder? You say that you use this gunpowder to destroy whole cities and kill people? Why would I want to learn about such a terrible thing? But king, with gunpowder, you can make your country strong and defeat your enemies. The king looked at me as if he thought I was crazy. I don't want to hear about this gunpowder. I have no use for something like that. Why didn't the king understand? It was all so simple, I thought. King, with gunpowder, everyone in your kingdom would follow your every command. The king looked at me sternly. They already do, he said. Please, good sir, never speak to me of this again. It was clear to me that the people of this land did not understand anything about running a country. How can the king have a strong government and control his people without weapons and war, I thought. The conversation with the king gave me a lot to think about. I thought the king was a very intelligent man, but I could never fully understand his philosophy. Chapter 6. Many Dangers. Brobdingnag was a very dangerous place for someone as small as I. In this land, because everything was so large, even a mosquito could hurt me seriously. When the queen decided to build a small pond for me to sail in, I realized just how dangerous this country could be. The Queen had become very interested in my stories of travel on the sea. One day, she asked me if I would like to show her my sailing skills. Of course, good Queen, but I must find a boat that is small enough for me. Where in Brobdingnag can we find such a boat?
Don't worry, my good man. I will have my people build you a boat,
said the Queen.
I do not want you to risk your life on the ocean. So I will have a small pond built for you to sail in. I and all my ladies shall come and watch you sail.
A few days later, the pond and the boat were ready for me. The pond was about as large as a small lake, so I had plenty of room to sail. I enjoyed traveling around in the water and singing songs about the sea, while the Queen and her ladies watched me and laughed. However, one day something awful happened. The Queen had her servants fill my pond with fresh water every day. On that day, one of the servants was careless and did not notice a giant frog swimming in the pond. The frog swam down to the bottom of the pond and stayed there. None of us noticed the frog when I began to sail my boat that afternoon. I was talking to one of the ladies when I felt something enormous hit the boat. I almost fell into the water. Suddenly, a large green frog as big as me jumped onto the boat. There was nothing I could do because I had no weapon with me. The frog jumped high in the air, and before I could move, it was on top of me. I was covered with the frog's slime, which was a very unpleasant feeling. Of course, I was too large for the frog to eat, but it was so large and heavy that it was in danger of destroying the boat as it jumped around. Glumdalglitch, who had been standing in a corner of the room, ran over to grab the frog. However, I realized that there were many ladies in the room, and I wanted to defend myself to show them how brave and strong I was. I picked up an oar and began to hit the frog with it. This must have scared the animal, because it jumped off my boat into the water. One of the Queen's servants grabbed the frog out of the water and threw it out the window. I was all right, but my boat was almost completely destroyed.
Oh, my dear little man, you could have drowned,
cried the Queen. I don't think I want to sail any more, my Queen, I said. However, this was not the only time my small size put my life in danger. The next time was much more frightening. One of the king's men in the palace kept a pet monkey. The Queen and her ladies loved this monkey because it did tricks and jumped around in a very entertaining way. I had also enjoyed watching the monkey, but I was a little afraid of it because to me it was as large as an elephant. One day, Glumdalglitch had fallen asleep with her window open so that cool air could enter the room. I was asleep in my little box until I was woken up by some loud noises. I got out of bed and went outside my box onto the table. I looked around Glumdalglitch's room, thinking that perhaps she had woken up, but she was still sleeping. Suddenly, I saw something move and turned around to look. I was horrified to see the monkey standing on the table, staring at me with shining black eyes. I screamed with fear. The noise awoke Glumdalglitch, who jumped out of bed. However, before she could grab the monkey, it grabbed me, jumped out the window, and began to climb up the palace wall as fast as it could. As it climbed, the monkey held me tightly in its paw. Its sharp nails cut my skin, and I could hardly breathe. I was afraid to look around me because we were rising higher and higher into the air. I did not know what the monkey would do when he reached the palace's roof, but I felt sure that this was the end of my life. When Glumdalglitch saw what had happened, she ran to alert the king's soldiers and the monkey's owner. The soldiers ran outside and began to shout at the monkey, who became frightened. Before I knew what was happening, the monkey dropped me and began to climb back down the wall. I must have fallen 10 feet, and hitting the hard ground was very painful. As I lay there, trying to discover if my bones were broken, I realized that there was an extremely strong wind blowing. I was in danger of being blown right off the roof and falling many thousands of feet to my death. I tried to hold on to the roof, but it was very smooth and flat, and I quickly began to slide down it. I shouted for help, but I knew no one had heard me. Then I began to fall. I screamed. This was the end of everything. Suddenly, I felt a strong, warm hand catch me in the air. When the soldiers had run outside, one brave man had begun to climb up the palace walls immediately. He had seen me begin to fall and caught me. I was safe, but I had many injuries and had to stay in bed for a few weeks. These two experiences were very upsetting, of course. I had nearly died, and this made me think about my wife and children. I had not stopped thinking about them while I was in Brobdingnag, and I wanted to return home safely to them. I began to think about my life in England. There, I would always be safe from such dangers as giant animals. I didn't want to die accidentally because of a giant, friendly dog or a curious cat. I was happy in Brobdingnag, and people had been very kind to me, but I began to worry that I was not safe here. My greatest danger in this land was not caused by an animal. It was caused by a person. The queen had a servant who was a dwarf. He was only 30 feet tall, while everyone else was 60 feet tall or more. He was the shortest man in Brobdingnag. This servant was the queen's favorite until I arrived at the palace. After I came, she spent much of her time with me and did not pay attention to the dwarf. While I was living at the palace, the dwarf had become extremely jealous of me. Although I didn't know about it, he was always thinking of cruel things to do to me. Finally, the dwarf decided to get rid of me once and for all by killing me. One sunny day, I was having a pleasant breakfast with Glumdalglitch in the dining room. Glumdalglitch was cutting me little pieces of eggs and bacon and giving me crumbs of her toast. When she got up and left the room to bring us some more eggs and toast, I was left alone. Then I heard a man's voice. "Would you like some cream with your tea, little man?" I looked up and saw the queen's dwarf. He was staring at me strangely, and I had not heard him come into the room. "Certainly, sir," I said. "Very well, then. You can have it," he said. Suddenly, I felt the dwarf's hand around my body. Laughing softly, he picked me up and threw me into Glumdalglitch's bowl of cream. Of course, this bowl was like a deep pond to me, and I began to drown in the thick cream. I struggled in the cream for a few minutes before Glumdalglitch returned. I heard her call out,
"Where are you, Grildrig?"
"Help! Help! I'm in here!" I shouted. But a wave of cream washed over my head, and I began to sink. Glumdalglitch ran over and pulled me out of the bowl of cream.
"Little man, how did this happen?"
she cried. When I could speak, I told her the story. Of course, she was very angry.
"Don't worry, little man. The queen will punish that dwarf very badly."
When Glumdalglitch told the queen what had happened, the dwarf was beaten and thrown out of the palace. Chapter 7. Escaping Brobdingnag. Every day that I was in Brobdingnag, I missed my family and thought about returning home. However, the queen had paid 1,000 gold pieces for me, and I knew the queen would never let me leave. One sunny weekend, the king and queen decided to go to the beach. The queen carried me with her in my box. Of course, Glumdalclitch would come with us. Unfortunately, that weekend, Glumdalclitch became sick with a terrible cold and had to stay in bed. She could not take care of me as she had always done, so she instructed a young servant boy to stay with me. That afternoon, the boy and I decided to go to the beach to get some fresh air. The boy carried me down to the beach in my box, and while he watched me, I began to walk around in the warm yellow sand. As I walked, I stared out at the ocean. I felt sad as I thought about the thousands of miles that lay between me and my family. I walked past large shells and rocks and tried to build castles in the sand. Finally, I grew tired and went back to my box to sleep. The servant boy was some distance away from me. He was climbing around on some rocks, probably searching for tasty birds' eggs. I lay down on my bed and fell deeply asleep. I do not know how many hours I slept, but when I woke up, I thought that the servant boy was carrying me in an extremely rough manner. The whole box was swinging back and forth in a strange way. I got out of bed and looked out of my window. Instead of the familiar faces I knew, I saw nothing but blue sky and clouds. Have I died and gone to heaven? I thought. The servant who had built me my house had made a window on top so that I could lie on my bed and feel the sunshine. When I looked up at the window, I had a horrible surprise. A giant eagle was carrying me as it flew. I decided that the eagle must have flown down and grabbed my box before the servant boy could catch me. What will happen to me now? I thought. I found out soon enough. The next moment, the eagle let go of my box, and I began to fall quickly towards the earth below. As I fell, I thought about my wife and children and prayed to God that I would live. The next thing I remember was a loud sound and complete darkness. A moment later, I felt myself moving up again. Slowly, light began to come up through my windows. When I could stand, I looked out of my window, not knowing what I would see. All around me was the blue ocean. My box had not broken and was floating along in the water. Where I would finally arrive, I did not know. For 2 days I floated in the ocean. I had no food to eat or water to drink. I simply looked out the window and hoped that somehow I would be saved. On the morning of the 3rd day, I was awakened by the sound of footsteps. I didn't stop to think, but yelled out in the language of Brobdingnag, "Help! Please save me!" I was amazed to hear a man's voice answer me in English. "Hello? Is someone in there? Do you speak English?" "Yes," I cried. "Please lift my house up onto your ship. I've been trapped on the ocean for 3 days." There was silence for a few moments. "Are you crazy, friend? We can't lift this house up onto our ship. It's much too big." Immediately I realized my mistake. If these men spoke English, they must be my size. "Of course, you're right," I said. "Just get me out of here, please. I'm starving to death." In a few moments, a rope was lowered through the window in my roof. I held onto the rope and was pulled out of the house by 6 or 7 men. I could not believe that I was finally around people my own size after living so long in a land of giants. "Where do you come from?" I asked them excitedly. "We are sailing from England, and we're returning home now. Our captain saw a large object in the water and sent a group of us to see what it was. We never expected that we would find a house. Where do you come from?" I smiled. "It's a very long story. I'll be happy to tell it to you, but could you please take me back to your ship? I would like to return to England with you if I can. I haven't seen my family in a long time." When we were back on the ship, I told the men everything about the land of the giants. I am not sure that they believed me, but no one could explain why there was a house floating in the water. After a few months of sailing, I was finally home in England again. As I threw my arms around my wife and children, I felt that I would never want to leave home again. Part 3. A Voyage to the Country of the Huyanims. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Horses. For the next few years, I lived with my wife and children. Our lives were very happy, and I felt content living in England. It was a joy to watch my children growing older. Soon, my wife was pregnant with a third child. I was very excited. I hoped that my child would be a boy so that I could name him Gulliver. However, I did not get the chance to see my new baby. I was offered a job as the captain of a ship that would trade between England and the South Seas. The thought of leaving my family made me sad, of course, but I decided to take the job because the pay was high. My work on this ship as its captain was not easy. While traveling to the South Seas, many of my men became sick and died. Because of this, I had to find some new men to work for me. When we landed on the island of Barbados, I found some strong men who wanted to go to sea. Unfortunately, when we were at sea again, I learned that these men were criminals who were escaping from the police. One night, while I slept, these men told my other sailors that if they could control the ship, then they would pay them all a lot of money. When I woke up the next morning, I found that my door was locked from the outside. I was a prisoner on my own ship. For 2 days, no one spoke to me, and I was not given any food. Finally, on the third day, my door was opened, and one of the criminals entered. He told me that everyone had decided that I must leave the ship. I was put on one of our small boats and left near a small island. Luckily, the criminals allowed me to keep certain things, so that I still had my knife and some gold coins. Since I had no food or water, I had no choice but to row to the island. When I reached the island's beach, I rested for a short time and then began to search for any people who might live on the island. I hoped they would give me some food to eat and fresh water to drink. As I walked around the island, I saw some human footprints and many prints of horses' feet. There was no farmland, but only natural fields with tall green grasses. I followed some of the footprints until I arrived in an open field. Suddenly, I saw a group of animals in the distance. Some were standing on the ground, while others were sitting in the trees like monkeys. These animals were not like the animals I had seen before, and they were as large as people. I thought they were ugly and strange looking, and they frightened me, so I hid in the grass and watched them for a while. These animals walked on 4 legs, yet their bodies looked quite like humans. However, their backs and chests were covered with very thick hair, like a monkey's or a bear's. 2 of these animals began walking towards me, and I was afraid they would see me. All of a sudden, however, the whole group of animals turned and ran into a large forest nearby. I wondered What had scared them away so quickly? I stood up to look around, but I did not see anything except a horse walking slowly through the grass. When I stood up, the horse seemed surprised to see me. After a moment, he walked towards me and did not stop until he had come very close. He stared at me and walked around me 3 times. This horse is acting very strangely. He seems almost intelligent, I thought. When I tried to step around him and walk away, the animal put himself in my way. It would not let me pass. All the time his large, gentle eyes looked at me calmly. I reached out to try and touch the horse, but it stepped back and shook its head as if telling me not to do this. Then the horse began to neigh, and the sounds almost seemed like a kind of language. Suddenly, the horse gave an especially loud neigh, and immediately another horse came running over to us. I knew that these horses were not common, because the 2 of them gently hit each other's hooves together, as if they were shaking hands. This is amazing. The man who trained these horses must be the best animal trainer in the world, I thought. The horses continued to neigh to each other for a few more minutes. I decided that they were definitely communicating with each other. Then they hit each other's hooves again. The first horse I had seen, who was gray, moved his head to show me that I should walk in with him. Since I had no other place to go, I decided I might as well follow the strange animals. I was very tired from the adventures of the last few days, so I could not walk very quickly. The horses were looking closely at me all the time. They seemed to understand that I was tired, so they walked slowly. A few times we stopped so that I could rest. I had no idea where these animals could possibly want me to go. I wonder if these fine horses are taking me to meet their master, I thought. Chapter 2. The Truth About the Island. The horses and I walked for about 3 miles through the quiet green fields. Then we came to a building that was long and not very tall. It was made of a strong wood, just like my horse's stable in England. When we entered this building, another horse stood up from where it had been resting and walked over to us. This horse was smaller and more beautiful looking than the other 2. So I guessed that this was a female horse. She looked at me closely, like the other 2 had done. Then she turned to the large gray horse, and they spoke together for a while. I could not understand what the horses were saying, of course, but I heard one word, Yahoo, repeated many times. I saw that the mare was looking at me strangely, but I did not understand why. Soon, the gray horse moved his head, showing me that I should follow him. He took me outside the house and into another building nearby. When we entered the second building, I saw something very strange and frightening. 3 of the strange hairy animals I had seen earlier were sitting on the ground. From such a close position, I could see that they looked almost exactly like men. Each of them had a rope around their neck that was tied to a large piece of wood on the ceiling. They were eating some dirty vegetables and rotten meat by using their feet to hold the food to their mouths. These things are more like dirty animals than men, I thought. I did not understand why they were tied up or who they were, but I thought it was extremely strange that the horses seemed to be the most intelligent animals on this island. Then the gray horse said something to an old female horse that was standing nearby. This old horse then untied one of the hairy men's ropes by standing up on her back legs and using her teeth. Then she led the hairy man outside, and the gray horse told me to follow them. When we were all outside, the gray horse made me stand next to the hairy man. The horse looked at the two of us closely for a long time. I guessed that he was trying to discover if we were the same kind of animal. Our bodies were similar, but I did not have as much hair on my head, legs, and back as this animal did. Also, I was wearing clothes, and the animal was not. He was extremely ugly. I knew that I was not one of these hairy men who acted like apes, and I hoped the horse did not think I was one. After a while, the horse pointed at the hairy man with his head. Then he said the word Yahoo many times. I decided that these hairy men must be Yahoos. Then he pointed to some other horses that were watching us and said the word Huyanim many times. I guessed that this was the name for all the horses on the island. But where are the men? Where is the master of these horses? Surely they don't live here by themselves, I thought. It was difficult to believe that these horses were as intelligent as human beings, and that they lived here without men to take care of them. But soon I learned that this was the truth. There were no men on the island, only the Huyanims and the Yahoos. Chapter 3. Human or Yahoo. In the next days and weeks, I was able to feed myself by using the oats that the Huyanims ate to make bread. I drank milk or water and found herbs in the forest to eat with my bread. Soon I decided to learn the Huyanims' language. The gray horse, who was one of the leaders of the Huyanims, helped me to study. After a few months, I was able to understand his questions and could give him simple answers. The gray horse was very curious about where I had come from. I soon learned that the Huyanims believed that I was a Yahoo because our bodies were so similar. They had never seen a normal human being before. "You do not have as much hair as our Yahoos on this island, and you are not as ugly," said the gray horse to me one day. "You are also much more intelligent, as I have seen. But your head and hands and legs are just like theirs, so you must be a Yahoo. Who taught you to speak and act intelligently?" I laughed and explained to him that the English people were all very intelligent, and it was normal for us to have less hair. "We are not Yahoos, but human beings," I said to him. "But how did you get here from across the sea?" asked the gray horse. I explained to him that England was a great civilization with many strong ships to carry men around the world. I then told the horse about the criminals who had taken my ship and forced me to go to the Huyanims' island. I could see that the gray horse still did not believe me. He said, "You must be mistaken, or perhaps you are saying something that is not." At first I didn't understand what the gray horse meant, but later I learned that there is no word for lie in the Huyanims' language. This is because the Huyanims were not able to lie. However, the gray horse thought that I was not telling him the truth. "It is impossible that there is another land beyond the sea, and it is also impossible that a group of Yahoos could build something to cross the seas. If a Huyanim could not build something like this, then a Yahoo certainly could not." I could not speak the Huyanims' language very well yet, so I could not convince the gray horse that I was telling the truth. For the next 6 months, the gray horse and I studied the language and customs of the Huyanims every day. Soon I began to call him my teacher and master. The Huyanims who came to visit my master were always very surprised and interested to meet me. When they heard me speak their language, they were amazed. However, everyone still thought I was a Yahoo. I did not want the Huyanims to think I was an ugly, dirty Yahoo. Because of this, I always wore my clothing to make myself look as different as possible from the Yahoos. Of course, the Huyanims did not wear clothing, so they thought my clothing was part of my skin. After half a year, my clothing had become old and in bad condition. It was very dirty and torn, so that my skin showed through in some places. Now the Huyanims could see that this clothing was not part of my skin. When my master discovered this, he asked me to take off my outside skin, as he called my clothes. I agreed and took off my clothing one piece at a time. First, I took off my coat, and then removed my shirt and pants. My master watched me with great interest and was very curious about clothing and its purpose. "Why do you wear this strange outer skin?" my master asked. "Well, it protects my people from the hot and cold air, and it lets us hide the parts of our body that nature wants us to hide," I said. My master looked as if he did not understand. "Certainly, nature has created our bodies. Therefore, nature does not want us to hide anything. My people do not need these clothes," he said. When I finished undressing, my master looked over my body closely, walking around me in a circle a few times. "I see now that you are definitely a Yahoo," he said at last. This upset me very much. I did not want to be thought of as one of those terrible, ugly animals. "Master, I promise you, I am not one of those Yahoos. My people do not climb in trees, walk on 4 legs, or have thick hair all over our bodies," I cried. But my master was still convinced. "It is clear to me that you are a Yahoo. You have less hair on your body, you can speak, and you walk on 2 legs instead of 4. But the shape of your body is the same as a Yahoo's." I did not want to argue with my master any more. Instead, I decided to learn how to speak the Huyanims' language extremely well. In time, the Huyanims would realize I was as intelligent as they. Chapter 4. A Conversation About War. When my master saw that I could speak the language well, he began to take me to the homes of other important Huyanims, so that they could meet me. The other Huyanims had many questions for me. They wanted to know how I had learned to speak their language so well, and why I looked so different from the other Yahoos. One day, I went to meet an important doctor who was good friends with my master. When I told him about the ship I had traveled in, he asked, "But where were all the Huyanims? Who was leading the ship?" I told the horse that there were no Huyanims on the ship, only men. "But why is a group of Yahoos allowed to operate something as important as a ship? The Huyanims should do this work," he said. I saw that I was going to have to tell the Huyanims something they might not like. "Well, sir," I said slowly, "in the rest of the world, my people, who you call Yahoos, are the masters, and the Huyanims are the slaves. We ride on the backs of the Huyanims and use them for work. In my country, we call them horses." There was a long silence as the horses stared at me. Again, I was accused of lying, or saying things that were not. Although most Huyanims did not believe my stories, my master slowly began to believe me. He still called me, and all human beings, Yahoos, but he became very interested in the country of England. "I am curious to know about a land run by Yahoos. It must be a dark and terrible place," he said to me. So I began to tell the Huyanims the story of England. I explained how the country was born, and I told them many stories of its kings and queens. The master was very interested to hear about England's recent history, and was very curious about all of England's wars. "The Houyhnhnms are very peaceful, and we have never had a war before," he said. First, my master wanted to know why England fought with other countries in Europe. I thought about this for a while and said, "Well, sir, there are many reasons why we have wars. One reason is that our kings or queens think that they do not have enough land or power. They want more people to rule over, so they make a war with another country. If our leaders win the war, then they will have more people to help them find more money and power. Often, these kings and queens kill or imprison the leaders of the countries they want to rule over." I continued to give more reasons for war. Sometimes there are wars for religious reasons. In our land, we have a religion called Christianity. For many hundreds of years now, there have been many wars between the strong Christian countries and the weaker countries, which have other religions. Now, there are different types of Christianity. For example, English people are Protestant Christians, and the French people are Catholics. France and England often fight, and millions of men have been killed in these wars. I was about to explain about the strength of the great English army when my master interrupted me. "Now I am sure that your people are Yahoos," he said to me. "Only countries with Yahoos for leaders would be able to have these wars. Only Yahoos could kill others and treat people so terribly. Yahoos are not only ugly and stupid, they are also very cruel." I did not know what to say to change my master's mind. I thought about my master's opinions and wondered if he was right. Maybe human beings were wrong to make wars. But I loved my country and my people, and I wanted to convince my master that we were a great people. Chapter 5. The Life of the Houyhnhnms. More months passed, and I realized how happy I was living with the Houyhnhnms. Their way of living was very honorable and beautiful. I came to believe that the Houyhnhnms were truly wonderful, and in many ways they were much better than the people of England and Europe. Although the Houyhnhnms thought I was a Yahoo, they were always very kind to me, because I studied hard and enjoyed living with them. The Houyhnhnms did not hurt each other, and they believed in showing kindness and friendship to each other. I found that the culture of the Houyhnhnms was very different from ours, and I learned much about their way of life while I was on the island. The Houyhnhnms' way of raising their children was unusual. First, the older horses did not love their own children more than others. Instead, they treated all of the children with equal love and care. When the female Houyhnhnms had given birth to 2 children, a boy and a girl, they did not have any more children. However, if a female had 2 boys, they would exchange one of the boys with a family that had 2 girls. In this way, there were never too many Houyhnhnms on the island, and there was always enough food and drink for everyone. However, there was a group of servant Houyhnhnms who were allowed to have 3 children. These servants worked for the more noble and honorable families and were treated very well. The Houyhnhnms gave their children a very good education. It was so good that I came to believe that my people in England should follow it exactly. The children were taught to be clean, to work hard, and to keep their bodies healthy. They were never allowed to eat or play too much. The Houyhnhnms gave their girl and boy children exactly the same education, except that the girls were taught how to manage a house. I thought this was very interesting, because in Europe, we educated our girls and boys very differently. Many girls did not go to school, but instead cooked, cleaned, and had children. The boys went to school and learned how to be doctors, lawyers, or soldiers. When I explained this to my master, he was shocked. "But this is terrible," he said to me. "You should educate your boy and girl children in the same way. Girls are just as intelligent as boys, aren't they? It seems to me that one half of your people, the women, are good for nothing but having babies and cleaning the house. If so many of your people are not educated, how can you hope to make your country good and strong? Your women cannot really raise their children because they do not know anything about life. So you see, this is another reason why your people are yahoos." I was beginning to believe him. Chapter 6. The Great Meeting. Every 4 years, the leaders of the different parts of the island would hold a meeting. This meeting lasted 5 or 6 days. During this time, the Huyanim leaders discussed how their areas of the country were doing. Much of the conversation was about oats and cows, which the Huyanims used for milk. If the Huyanims in any part of the country needed more oats or cows, then the others always shared generously. By this time, I had lived with the Huyanims for a year, and one day my master told me that it was time for the great meeting. He wanted the leaders to meet me, so he asked me to come with him to the meeting. I was very happy to go with him, because I was curious to listen to the Huyanims talk together. When my master and I arrived at the meeting spot, I saw that the other leaders were surprised that the gray horse had brought along a Yahoo with him. But when they heard how well I spoke their language, they decided to let me stay and listen to them. After the leaders had discussed how their parts of the country were doing, the gray horse stood up and began to talk. "We have one more thing to speak about," he said. "This is a question which has been troubling all the Huyanims for some time. Now, I think the time has come for us to discuss it. The question is, what should we do about the Yahoos? They have caused our people many problems for years. They have stolen our milk and killed our cows and eaten our oats and grass. We watch them carefully, but they often escape and cause trouble. We must think of some way to control them." One of the other horses stood up and began to speak. "Gray Huyanim, I agree with you. Truly, the Yahoos are a very serious problem," he said. "I think that the answer to our problem is to kill them all for the good and safety of our people. They are miserable animals, and I am sure they will be happier dead than alive." This horse continued to talk about how terrible the Yahoos were. "These Yahoos are eating up all the fruits, berries, and plants on our island. If a Yahoo escapes his cage, he will eat the first thing he sees, whether he is hungry or not. Then he continues to eat until he is sick. I have noticed that the Yahoos like to eat things they have stolen or killed more than the food we give them. They like to steal our good fruits and plants. The worst thing is, the Yahoo's favorite thing to eat is rotten meat from dead animals. I think they would even eat a Huyanim if they could. This is horrible and cannot be allowed. If we do not do something about these animals, they will destroy all the plants, eat up all the fruit, and kill all the animals." Then the horse began to discuss the history of the Yahoos. The Yahoos were not always in this country. They came to this land a long time ago. I do not know where they came from, Perhaps the sea made them, or the earth. 2 of them appeared on our island, and in time they had many children. Soon there were so many Yahoos that our people, the Huyanims, were in danger. The Huyanims decided to hunt for all the Yahoos and tie them up. The oldest Yahoos were killed, and today each Huyanim keeps 2 Yahoos in a cage in his house. These Yahoos are used for pulling and carrying things and, as we all know, are much lower than even the lowest servant. I believe that our people should begin to keep donkeys instead of these Yahoos. They are tamer and are easy to care for. The donkeys will not steal from us or kill our cows. I will say to all of you again, we should kill the Yahoos. The other Huyanims agreed with this horse, and they began to discuss how the Yahoos should best be killed. Suddenly, my master waved his head and began to speak. I understand all your feelings of anger towards the Yahoos. It is true that they do many terrible things to our land. However, I have another idea that may work. Everyone stopped speaking and listened to my master. I believe that the first 2 Yahoos in our land became so savage and terrible because they had no education and no one to talk to. So, after many years, they and their children became the terrible animals they are today. I think that the Yahoos have their own countries far away, although they are very below us Huyanims. These other Yahoos are not as bad as the ones on our island. They have their own language and their own cities. How do you know all of this? Asked one of the other Huyanims. As you all know, I have lived with a Yahoo for a year now, my master said and pointed to me with his head. This Yahoo comes from a country called England, which is full of Yahoos like him. They do not have as much hair as the Yahoos in our country, and they wear an outer skin called clothing. This Yahoo's people are very wild and stupid, like our Yahoos. They do not educate their children properly, and they have things called wars, where they kill one another for no reason. This Yahoo has told me that in his land, the Yahoos use the Huyanims as slaves, but I do not believe him. However, I do believe that this Yahoo is special. He can speak our language, and he enjoys our way of life. Although he is very inferior to the Huyanims, I believe that if we train the Yahoos from birth to speak our language, we may be able to live with them. They will be better servants. My master continued his speech. There is another reason why the Yahoos may make good servants if we train them to act like this Yahoo, he said and pointed to me again. I have noticed something interesting about the Yahoos that we Huyanims keep in our homes. Sometimes one of these Yahoos will act very strangely. He will leave the other Yahoos and go and lie down in a corner of the room. Then he will begin to howl loudly and cry out as if he was sad or in pain. None of the other Yahoos can touch him or go near him. He will continue this behavior for days. At first, I did not understand why the Yahoos would act this way. They have enough to eat and are almost never sick. Also, they are too stupid to be sad about anything that is serious. However, I have found that there is one thing that stops the Yahoo from acting this way. If he is forced to do very hard work all day, like carrying rocks or pieces of wood, then he will act normally again. So, you see, if we train the Yahoos from birth to do hard work for us, then they may be good servants. No one said anything for a moment. I knew that if the Huyanims believed that killing the Yahoos was the reasonable thing to do, then they would not hesitate. However, the Huyanims did not believe in killing anything without a very good reason. I thought about all the things my master had said. His description of the Yahoos in his house reminded me of many people I knew in England. Although they had enough food to eat and a place to live, they were still unhappy and complained often. They might even be rich, but all the money in the world could not make them happy. Perhaps these rich, lazy people should be forced to do hard work also, I thought. Then they would not complain so much and live healthier, better lives. Perhaps the people of Europe were more like the Yahoos than I had thought. Finally, the other Huyanims agreed to think about my master's ideas for a while. For the next few nights, my master went alone to discuss the problem of the Yahoos with the other leaders of the country. I wanted to go with him, but he did not allow it. On the last day of the meeting, my master said, "Well, Yahoo, the Huyanims have decided to try my idea for a while. We will train the Yahoos to be more like you, instead of killing them. We will also make them work harder for us, lifting and carrying things." I was happy that the Huyanims had decided not to kill the Yahoos. It would be very sad to see these peaceful horses use violence to get what they wanted. Chapter 7. Sad News. After the Huyanims' great meeting, my life on the island got even better. I had been living with the gray horse and his family, but one day my master gave me a little house of my own. It looked just like the other Huyanims' houses. I made beds and chairs for my house from weeds and grasses, and lived a very comfortable life. Eventually, of course, my old clothes were completely destroyed, so I made myself new clothes out of rabbit skins. Every day I ate bread, milk, and herbs, but often I would hunt for rabbits or small birds to eat. I was happier than I had ever been before, living my simple life with the great and wonderful Huyanims. I loved them so much that I decided never to leave the island. I knew that I could never live with human beings again. They were too savage and stupid. I was even happier living here than in the city of Nottingham with my wife and children. I knew that as long as I lived here, I would never experience greed, jealousy, or unkindness as I had in the lands of Lilliput and Brobdingnag. There were no wars and corruption like there were in England and Europe. I had lived with the Huyanims so long that my own people seemed like Yahoos to me. I respected the Huyanims so much that my greatest dream was to be like them. Sometimes, when other Huyanims came to visit my master, I was allowed to sit in the room and listen to their conversation, which made me very happy. I would never speak to one of these great Huyanims unless they spoke to me first. I was happy to be able to answer any of their questions, and I hoped that the more time I spent with the Huyanims, the more like them I might become. When the Huyanims spoke together, they never argued or interrupted each other. Everyone was always polite and listened happily to everyone else. Often, instead of speaking, they would sit quietly together for a while. I admired this very much. I had been on the island for more than 2 years and thought that I had everything I needed. One day, my master sent for me. "I have something I must tell you," he said to me. I was worried because his voice sounded different than usual. "What is it, master?" I asked. My master looked uncomfortable. "I have spoken with the other leaders of the country," he said. "I do not know how you will react to what I am going to say, So please be calm. Do you remember the great meeting you saw about a year ago? We discussed the problem of the Yahoos for several days. However, there was something I did not tell you. The leaders were very upset that I kept you, a Yahoo, in my house, and gave you our food to eat. Now, you have your own house and spend time with many Huyanims. The leaders feel that I am treating you like a Huyanim instead of a Yahoo. I talk to you often, and the other leaders do not believe that talking with a Yahoo is a pleasant or useful thing to do. The leaders believe that these actions are not reasonable. I have been asked to make you a servant like the other Yahoos in this country. However, I do not want to do that, because I have learned that you are different from them. So I must order you to leave here. You must go back to your own country and never return here again. I cried out in sadness and immediately fainted. When I woke up a few minutes later, I began to cry terribly. I could not believe that I had to return to my country. I thought of my own people as dirty, stupid Yahoos, and I did not want to live with them ever again. However, I had no choice but to leave. In a few weeks, I had built a small boat from some trees that had recently died and had all the food and other supplies I needed. I was ready to leave the land of the Huyanims. I said goodbye to my master and his family with tears in my eyes. Then I got in my canoe and began the journey back to my own land. I was so unhappy that I wanted to die. Chapter 8. The End of My Story. It took a full year for me to reach England. I had traveled alone in my canoe for about a week before finding a Portuguese ship with many men. It took months before I could speak to these Yahoos without feeling sick, but I was finally able to talk to their captain, a man named Don Pedro de Mendez. The ship arrived back in Portugal 11 months later. For a few days, I waited to find a ship going to England. In all this time, I could not stop thinking about the wonderful Huyanims. My wife and children were surprised and happy to see me. They had thought I was certainly dead. When my wife tried to kiss me, I fainted and did not awake for more than an hour. I could not touch a horrible Yahoo. Seeing my family filled me with anger and sadness. I was ashamed to be one of them. All I wanted was to live peacefully with the Huyanims again. When I realized that I was the father of more Yahoos, I felt terrible. I did not ever want to see or talk to any of them again, but I had nowhere else to go. Now it has been 5 years since I returned to England from the land of the Huyanims. During my first year back at home, I could not stay in the same room with my wife and children. The smell of them made me sick, and they seemed just like the Yahoos on the island to me. Now, neither my wife nor children are allowed to touch me or anything that belongs to me. Sometimes I allow my wife to sit across from me at the table. She is only allowed to speak to me when I ask her a question, however. One of the first things I did when I returned to England was to buy 2 strong, beautiful horses. I keep them in a stable near my house, and I spend many hours every day with them. When I am with the horses, the only other person I see is the stable boy. I do not mind him because he smells like the wonderful horses. I have taught my 2 friends the Huyanims' language so that we can speak together. I tell them stories of the country of the Huyanims, which they enjoy, and we are very happy together.